There is a good tradition in art history to begin the history of medieval art with the Roman catacombs, more precisely with the Christian paintings in the Roman catacombs. Now, that might seem weird. After all, everybody knows that Middle Ages and ancient Rome are two different periods, right? Well, keep in mind, medieval art is a very broad concept. For example, there is late antique art, produced at dusk of antiquity and already bearing some medieval features. Then there is a period called Early Middle Ages, when completely primitive, naive, and even barbarian art was produced. And finally, there are Gothic cathedrals. Now, the gap between three is enormous, but it is generally believed that the first seeds from which this magnificent Gothic tree has eventually developed, and yes, I like metaphors, so you better get used to it. So those seeds were planted by those first Christians who decorated the catacombs with the clumsy and naive frescoes. All the principles of medieval art are predicated on those early murals. Therefore, we will start with them. Our lecture consists of two parts. First, we will talk about which plots are most often found in catacombs. And I have good news for you. There are not so many. Early Christian artists had a favorite set of stories that they narrated time after time in their works. So, after this lecture, if you go to Italy and decide to go on tour to the catacombs, all those common themes will be familiar to you. You will be able to interpret them with ease, and your companions will be flabbergasted by your knowledge. On the other hand, some mural plots are very unusual, very rare, and at first they might be confusing. Of course, we will also talk about those. The second part of our lecture will be a little more complex and more theoretical. We will talk about what place those catacomb murals occupy in the history of art, why they deviate from antique art so much, and is it really the basis for all medieval art? In a word, we will talk about general assessments and global concepts, and we will argue a little with the respected art historians. I will try, as always, to tickle your brain a little and to tease your mind. But before we proceed, let's say a few words about the Roman catacombs themselves. Now, you already probably have an idea of what they were. Underground passages where Romans buried their dead. Those passages and chambers were made in the soft rock called limestone. Usually it is a corridor or a hall with a number of small niches in the walls where the bodies were placed. Well, everything seems to be clear so far, but it is important to note one detail, namely, there is a widespread misconception about the catacombs. They are believed to be special underground shelters created by Christians themselves to hide there from prosecutions. And this is a complete concoction which must be allayed, and that's exactly what I'm going to do now. Catacombs were not created by Christians, and they were not intended as recourse. On the contrary, they were pagan cemeteries. You see, the advent of Christianity has changed, among other things, the perception of death in general, and of a dead body in particular in ancient Rome. You see, any corpse was regarded as a source of ritual impurity in that time. Hence the prohibition to bury the dead within city borders. All cemeteries had to be located outside the city walls. In the Middle Ages, the attitude towards death has changed drastically. Cemeteries were now located within city limits. If you have been fortunate to travel around Europe, like myself, you must have seen those medieval cemeteries. They are breathtaking. So, in Rome, it was impossible to bury the dead within the city limits. However, there was a way around that prohibition. Name of the trick was catacombs. Apparently, they were not considered part of the city, and regulation did not apply to them. So, buying a spot there instead of in a cemetery was cheaper. Therefore, not only Christians were buried there, but pagans too. But it was Christians, however, whose specific needs catacombs fit perfectly, because they allowed them to conduct their rituals in secrecy. As far as we know, early Christians called their gatherings agapas, which means feasts of love or meals of peace. They seem to be modeled after the Last Supper. And of course, when gathering to share bread and brotherly love, Christians would rather not get any more attention than they absolutely had to. After all, in the eyes of Roman authorities, they were a sect, and a suspicious one at that. But were they actually hiding there from persecutions? Probably sometimes. However, it must be understood that persecutions of Christians in Rome were sporadic. They waxed and waned depending on where every next emperor stood on Christianity. So, even if catacombs were occasionally used as shelters, that was not their main function. Also, location of catacombs was no secret. After all, they were cemeteries, like I said, and they were not used exclusively by Christians. Therefore, trying to find a refuge there wouldn't make much sense. If Roman authorities wanted to find and arrest Christians, they would not have any problems finding them there. If anything, hiding in catacombs would make their job easier. No place to run, right? Great. We have allayed this little misconception. Now let's move on to what scenes those early murals usually represent. Although, you know what? We are not ready yet. I'm sorry for dragging this, but I must make two more preliminary notes. They regard two fundamental innovations introduced by Christian artists. I'm sorry, but it just has to be done. Now, the first innovation is the implementation of symbols. This was almost non-existent in ancient art. The closest thing to symbolism that antique art had were attributes. That is to say, objects by which a viewer could identify what character or god is represented. Apollo was usually depicted with a bow and arrows, Zeus with lightning, and so on. Pagan artists never really went beyond that. On the contrary, Christians used a large number of symbols, allegories, and signs. Objects found in catacombs often have meaning beyond their physical appearance. And apparently, viewers were expected to comprehend it. Now, you might ask, why? Why was this innovative approach introduced by Christians? I think the answer is absolutely clear. Pagan gods were very tangible, very, if you want to speak the language of classical philosophy, which I do want to speak, they were very immanent. That is to say, they were modeled after people, after humans. They had the appearance of mortals, only more beautiful and powerful. They succumbed to fear and jealousy. They felt in love or rage. They were morally imperfect. And they existed within our physical world, high on top of the mountain Olympus, and yes, unreachable for humans, but still in the realm of human reality. Obviously, one would not need to rely on abstract symbols in order to convey the idea of an antique god. Simply representing them as idealized humans would suffice. Christian God, however, is a completely different story. In the 6th century, famous Christian theologian, his name was Dionysius the Areopagite. About him we will talk later because he has a heavily influenced medieval philosophy, so stay tuned for that. So he said that God hides in darkness. What he meant was God is completely beyond our comprehension. Really, we can't say anything about him at all, because to describe and to define also means to limit, and God is infinite. Therefore, we cannot say that he is light or darkness, that he is great or small, for he is both. Contradictions are reconciled in God. Therefore, our language is completely useless when it comes to pondering him. But it is still necessary to talk about him somehow. How? By using symbols. And that's exactly, says Dionysius, why the Bible contains numerous descriptions of God as a pillar of fire or as a voice that speaks from a burning bush. All those descriptions are merely symbols, ways to give people at least some vague idea of what God actually is. Moreover, Dionysius proposes an interesting concept. He says that sometimes God in the Bible is compared to objects that seem completely inappropriate. And this is done specifically to make a point, which is God is omnipotent and can manifest himself through anything he wants. Therefore, when Christian artists try to render divine things that are beyond our five senses, things like eternity, immortal soul, or the Holy Spirit, they do not know how to depict all this. It is clear that Christ, that is, incarnated God, can still be represented. But what about the Holy Spirit? He is disembodied, and there is no way for a human hand to draw or mold him. So the artist's only option is to depict it in the form of, for example, a pigeon. Such painting would not imply that the Holy Spirit has actual resemblance to a pigeon. That would be blasphemy. It would be a mere reminder to a viewer, a reference to a spiritual entity which otherwise cannot be rendered. This is where the need for symbols kicks in. And we will see what an intricate symbolical system was developed by Christian artists. Okay, now let's take a look at some common symbols. Well, the first and probably the most common one is a fish. Sometimes fish is depicted together with loaves, like here. But more often there is a single fish, like here. Oh, by the way, about the second image, I have a short but interesting story. I almost messed up, because when I was looking for pictures for this lecture, I found this image on Wikipedia, yes, like a normal person, and I liked it. But then I looked at it more closely, and it hit me. Wait, something is wrong. It is too neat and clean to be a real antique artifact. So I double-checked, and it turned out that this is actually not a real antique object, but a souvenir from Rome. But it looks quite similar to a real object, so I decided to keep it. However, have I stated that this is a genuine antique artifact? That would be embarrassing. So, there is already a valuable lesson for you to get from this lecture. Always carefully check the reliability of your sources, otherwise you risk looking like a joke. Okay, back to our fishes. The use of a fish as a symbol by early Christians is well documented. But why was the fish a symbol of Christ? That's a good question.